I would like to thank my opponents and the judges for making this debate possible today. First, we're starting off with several definitions. Our first definition has to do with the word of "at." This means that the protest must take place inside the funeral and not outside of the funeral. It must be at the funeral and in the funeral process itself. And then political demonstration has to do specifically with those opposed to the beliefs of the mourners. I mean, any military funeral in general is somewhat a political demonstration because you are supporting what someone has done for your country in a political manner and inherently assuming that it was justified, they died for their country. So we need to look at political demonstrations in order to narrow this debate as those that are necessarily opposing those involved in the mourning process and really counterintuitive to what we want to be said at the mourning process in general. Our weighing mechanism for this round is to prove that the affirmation of the resolution is justifiable, and essentially this is a fact debate. We have to prove that it's justifiable, that they should not be allowed to demonstrate at these funerals, and then our opponent conversely have to prove that it is not justifiable to prevent these people from protesting at these demonstrations. Yes?
Considering you already can't walk into a funeral uninvited, how is this a topical definition at all?
What do you mean you can't walk into a funeral uninvited?
Yeah, I was just trying to, how do you pretty much qualify your definitions when currently you can't walk inside a funeral home if you're not a part of the mourning group?
I mean, specifically, it depends on where the funeral takes place. I mean, I'm sure there's different procedures for different funerals, and that scenario would be justifiable. But we're saying it has to necessarily interact with those that are mourning at the process. Yes.
Okay, so would it be at a funeral, if a funeral's going on and 100 feet away there are people picketing, does that count as at the funeral?
I mean, what we're saying is as long as the people undergoing the funeral process know that people are there and are aware of the entire process. We're not trying to exclude ground. We're just trying to make this a debate that's actually a possible debate. Okay, so our first main argument comes from the fact that these soldiers have given their life for their country and they deserve a proper burial. This is an innate right. After you've given your life for your country, especially to support the First Amendment and the basic rights that we all deserve, you deserve the right to a burial, and you deserve for it to be recognized that you have given your life in support of your country. And specifically, if we allow them to just come here and deny the value of these people's lives and use them as a mechanism to fuel for these protesters to use the person's death as a mechanism to fuel their hatred and basically pass on their message, it denies the value of the soldier's life in general. Also, this uses their life as an expression of hate and denies the statement made by the soldier in enlisting and dying for their country. Essentially, when you enlist in your army, you assume that whatever your army is doing is justified or that you support your nation in a certain way. This becomes a statement in and of itself and is an expression of speech. So, by denying the person the right to actually make this statement at their funeral and make this statement in a coherent way, in mourning someone's life and losing their life for their country, these protesters themselves are essentially denying freedom of speech, so they can't uphold freedom of speech like our opponents may make in the next, or like the argument our opponents may make in the next speech. Second of all, the Supreme Court has ruled laws governing the time and place of speech are constitutional. While you may not prohibit the statement in and of itself, we're prohibiting where the statement may actually be made, which is an entirely logical thing to do. For example, you should not be able to scream fire in a crowded room because it may cause people to be trampled. The limits on where you say certain things is entirely justifiable, and this is in no way unconstitutional. So we're debating what effects this actually has on someone's life. Our third argument comes from the fact this increases the harm upon the families of the soldiers. They're already undergoing an extremely traumatic process. They've seen their son, brother, or some other family member, or even their friend die for their country, and now we're allowing people to mock and ridicule this entire process just to fuel their own hatred. The fact of the matter is this drastically increases the harms upon these families, and it creates a negative atmosphere in general, and these families are due the right to mourn their dead soldiers peacefully. I mean, they've given up a family member for their country, and we're assuming that they aren't due peaceful mourning? This is extremely ludicrous. Our fourth argument is that a funeral is not a public event. The fact of the matter is that these funerals aren't a public event, so these people can limit freedom of speech. If they don't want people protesting at the funeral, then they can prohibit it. It's not the government necessarily prohibiting it. Or it's not the government actively taking action, but it's the government enforcing the private family's own beliefs at an extremely private matter. For example, you wouldn't want people standing at your son's funeral and screaming "God hates fags" or many other things that have been said at these funerals. That was an exact example. Or also the fact that the God hates dead soldiers, or thank God for IEDs. There are horrible things being said at these funerals that are mimicking and mocking the deaths of these soldiers. That's absolutely ludicrous and should not be happening whatsoever. Now, our fifth argument is that the family has the First Amendment right to freedom of assembly, allowing them to protect the funerals however they please and participate in them however they please. They have the right to assemble at these funerals, and basically also under the First Amendment, they have freedom of religion to participate in the funeral however they want, based on their own beliefs. Therefore, if people are infringing upon this, as they would be if they were saying God hates fags, or many of the other things that we've said these protesters have been declaring at these funerals, it's infringing upon the mourners' rights themselves. So we shouldn't allow a rights violation in order to uphold rights. This is extremely counterintuitive, and if our opponents are going to come up here in the next speech and blab about the First Amendment, we need to look at the First Amendment is already being violated. So we can't say that we shouldn't violate the First Amendment when the First Amendment is already being violated. We need to actually weigh the sides as to which is more constitutional, or which is more justifiable, and it's not a matter of purely constitutionality, because both sides can be deemed constitutional. Our sixth argument is that soldiers are the reason we have the First Amendment. If someone wasn't out there fighting for our rights, well, we simply wouldn't have them. We have to have people upholding these rights, and therefore now more than ever, we must look to soldiers and hold their lives valuable. Because if we don't do this, we will lose the very rights that we need. Well, my opponents may come up in their next speech and make a slippery slope argument about how denying constitutional rights will lead to the denial of more constitutional rights. Without soldiers in general, we wouldn't have these constitutional rights, so even a slight denial becomes justifiable. Thank you.
All right, first and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone. First, I'm going to talk about their definition of political demonstrations. And they said that this means that they're opposing those at the funeral. Just to make a brief clarification, there's already in the status quo the Supreme Court case, Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, which states that lewd, obscene, profane, libelous, and fighting words that neither express nor possess social value are not protected under the First Amendment. So based in their definition, we pretty much have to assume that the things being said don't have social value. Otherwise, they already in the status quo aren't protected by the First Amendment, and that just ties up any loose ends or any uneven ground on their side. Because if you otherwise it just becomes a debate about what rights you can and can't have at a funeral, and specifically rights that we would all agree like you shouldn't have at a funeral. Like I can't go and shoot people at the funeral. Well, obviously there's a Supreme Court case to support that. Like I shouldn't do that. So at the same time, I'm just like bring that up. There's a question about that. Yes.
Just to clarify, you're saying that if it has like a political impact, if it's a political statement, it becomes justifiable. Like what does the impact of the argument?
Meaning that if I'm saying something that has no social or that doesn't express or possess social value, then I don't have the right to pretty much say it because it's obscene or offensive or that kind of thing. Which is why the examples that you brought up with the Westboro Church, the Supreme Court actually affirmed their right to do so because what they were saying does have political value. And so that was just briefly, and that's, I'm pretty sure, where the debate was meant to be headed, so it was just brief clarification. So their first contention is that they deserve a proper burial, and that there's this unnecessary hate, and it devalues their death and denies their freedom of speech. The problem with this, though, is that you can have two protests across from each other, just like you can have like a soldier with his freedom of speech and protesters with their freedom of speech, and both can exist at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, meaning that soldiers are still able to pretty much have their freedom of speech and have an honorable burial with this protest going on. It's completely contextual. You can see that these two freedoms of speech can occur at the same time. Their second contention is that it can be restricted. This is pretty much a status quo argument. We know that it can be restricted because of the Supreme Court cases, so this doesn't actually help them and they don't impact this out. So I ask you to drop the second contention. Yes, freedom of speech can be restricted if it doesn't have social or if it doesn't have social value, and there's no reason to establish that because obviously we are only talking about protest that does have social value. Third contention is that it increases the harm upon the families. But the actual Supreme Court case regarding the Westboro Church stated that you can't protect for people's reactions. And the reason this is important, the actual terminal impact of this precedent set by the Supreme Court, is that when you say something, you can't be punished for how other people react to it. Meaning that I can take offense to something that someone else may take no offense to at all. And for that reason, you cannot punish the same speech because it's completely in different scenarios. Yes.
Wouldn't you agree that there's a justifiable reaction to the scenario? It's not basically a variable reaction. Like any person in a scenario would react the same way, so it should be outlawed.
No, because the members of the Westboro Church themselves are entitled to their own opinion and their own freedom of expression. I'll get onto that in my case. But yes, even though there might be like overwhelming opposition to this, that's why people can go ahead and like make blocking walls, so that they can't see them. Families can choose to go into private areas where where pretty much these protests legally can't occur. So we can see that there are ways around this if that's really important to them. And yes, we're not trying to say that what the Westboro Church says is like a good thing. We can all agree that these are bad things, but they maintain the right to say them for protecting our First Amendment right. Yes.
When you say that the affirmative has the right to go into a private area into the church, would you say that they're not actually marring the funeral process itself, so it's not actually negative ground?
No. Well, it is negative ground because what you're arguing is that pretty much people can't go inside those private places and protest, but that's already in the status quo, meaning that the status quo already has mechanisms to remedy for this offense. Was pretty much why it's negative ground, because there are built-in status quo pretty much catches to have people avoid this unnecessary protesting if they wish. Yes.
Just to clarify, you're saying that these people will be outside protesting, correct? Like
No. No. You can be, all right. I'll clear it up in your fourth contention, actually. Is that where I'm at? All right, fourth contention. Funeral isn't a public event. The places that these take place at funerals are only in public places. And in order to be topical, we have to be talking about the public places. In no way, shape, or form would it be topical to say that protesters aren't allowed to break into your house and start protesting. That's in no way topical, so we can see that what we are talking about is in actual public places like cemeteries, which is where the Westboro Baptist Church actually was protesting. So that's how we link to that, is that currently in the status quo, if you want to have a private pretty much session, you can have a private funeral. But if you choose to go in a public place, then people reserve their right to freedom of speech. And the reason you don't limit that is because if you start limiting freedom of speech in a public place, it starts setting poor precedent that people can act malevolently off of that. And it pretty much opens a massive can of worms precedent-wise. If you were to say that, yes, we can now limit freedom of speech in public places, the limitations that we have in the status quo, pretty much what we're arguing, are sufficient. And that we don't need any further, we wouldn't need any further policy, which is pretty much what this calls for in that manner. Because we currently have Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, and we do have privacy in funerals if we wish to have those. So the status quo fully supports the negative team in that way, which is what the negative team does. It supports the status quo. Their fifth contention is that people have the right to assemble. All right, you still have your right to assemble unless they're like stepping in on your area, which is already illegal. We can see that they're able to protest if they're like pushing people away or acting in some physical way to break them up. Then that's something different, but we can see that they still maintain the right to assembly. You can still assemble regardless of who else is there. 6 is that soldiers are the reason that we have rights. Yes, they are the reason that we have rights, but I don't see how this gains any affirmative ground in proving that political demonstrations shouldn't be held at funerals. The fact that they protect freedom of speech should show why a soldier would support freedom of speech, because people are expressing what they had fought for. So we have one contention in today's debate, and you guys actually hit the nail right on the head at the end of your last speech, and it is that the First Amendment right must be upheld because the precedent is too vital to the United States of America. It is what we are founded upon largely, and we can see that we must protect it in its entirety as the federal government. And we can see that when we do protect it, we pretty much secure people's ability to speak to an extent. We do have limitations, and we aren't arguing whether or not there should or should not be limitations. There are limitations. We're simply arguing that this limitation, limiting freedom of speech in a public place, which is what this breaks down to, is wrong. So for that reason, you should vote for the negation.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go NCAC. So to begin, we basically agreed with the definitions. It's the political demonstration has to have no, the words that they say have to have no social value. That's fine, we agree with it. So going right into contention one, what we said is basically the soldiers have a right to a proper burial, and what the protesters are doing is maliciously marring the funeral process itself and not going in for the political value of what they're saying. And what they're going in is saying purely to harm the funeral in itself. It's not to make a political stance. So ultimately, what they're saying, the response to this was that they're not mutually exclusive of one another. They can protest while having a respectful funeral, but the point of protesting at these funerals is not to actually bring your point out. Otherwise, you could go, like the Westboro Church, they went to the church itself, not right now, they went to the church itself to harm the funeral process itself, not to actually say that God hates homosexuals. The point of the church, the point was to harm the funeral process itself, and the reason why it's unjustifiable is the fact that the soldier himself expresses himself by joining the army and saying that I am giving my life for my country, and this is the expression that he's making, and the political demonstrations happening at the funeral are marring his his right to freedom of expression, and that is getting in the way of his First Amendment rights, which is essentially turning their only contention against.
All right, you stated that what's being said has to have no social value, when rather we defined it as has to have social value, otherwise in the status quo it's already protected.
All right, so just clarify. Okay. Yeah, so going into contention two, we talked about how the Supreme Court has ruled that you can only say things at certain times and places. So essentially they just went right over this, but you have to look to the actual context of contention two, which is essentially saying that you cannot go into wherever you want and blurt out things that you want to say. For like example, if I were on a plane, especially as an Arab, I cannot scream that there's a bomb on a plane. You can't scream that kind of thing because it's not appropriate for the time and place, and it threatens this. It puts everyone on the plane. It gives them. It threatens them, which is inherently why it's not okay. Why it's okay to limit freedom of expression in this case, and this is essentially what political demonstration at funerals do. They harm the value of the soldier himself. They hurt his expression to his nation, and they actually mar the funeral itself by having a political demonstrations there, which is simply why it's inappropriate. And just to overview, the negative continually assumes that the status quo is the negative position. It's essentially not true. The status quo is the affirmative position, so far as political demonstrations are not allowed inside of the funerals themselves. So going into, not right now, I'm getting in a second. So contention 3 talks about how you're harming the soldier's family, and the response to this is essentially you can't punish for the reaction of the family themselves. But first of all, that is absolutely a ridiculous argument because of the fact that we react to murder by being upset or being dead. It's not like the reaction of our feelings. It's innate to the human himself. If you mock his dead sibling, you will feel a certain way, and it's not the reaction that he takes. You can still punish the people inside the funeral for going out and killing a demonstrator. That's not what we're saying. The reaction is internally and morally hurting them. It is unethical to actually have these demonstrations outside because it's hurting them. It's innate to the family member themselves. So yeah, going to the fourth point is that the funeral is not a public event, and that the government can ensure, it needs to ensure that it's private. But they say that funerals themselves by the resolution, are innately public events. It's simply not true, as the fact that you can't go in and barge into a funeral. You have to have the family sets who's allowed to come to the funeral so that these kind of things don't happen. They don't just have people come into the funeral homes and say that they don't like the person who was killed or whatnot. So the fifth point is that the family has a right to freedom of assembly. And they say that they can still peaceably assemble without this is basically going back to contention 1, how they're not mutually exclusive of one another. But what I'd like to say is that in the First Amendment, when we have the right to freedom of assembly, it is assuming that our rights do not conflict over one another. Now, everyone has the right to freedom of speech, but if I were to continually blurt out things and I were to put my hand over the mouth of our negative opponents, that's marring his right to freedom of speech. You can't get in the way. The point is that you cannot get in the way of the freedom of assembly. If the rights conflict, then it is indeed a denial of the First Amendment. So now finally, the sixth point is that the soldiers are the reason we have these amendments. They stand for what we believe in, and without them, we wouldn't be able to actually have the society that we have. And there are our expression of, they express social responsibility here. Finally, going back to the Supreme Court case where we talked about how the captive jurisprudence, I forgot, it was the Supreme Court ruled essentially that you cannot have, you cannot say certain things at certain times and places because of the fact that it's inappropriate at times, like as I talked about how like the plain argument. So essentially the only argument that the negative has is the First Amendment. Now, as we've shown like many times, first of all, is that the people inside the political demonstrations themselves, they've been ruled to be not allowed, not in the Westboro or the New Hampshire case, but essentially they're not allowed under a statute of the Supreme Court, essentially saying that the rights of what we say, as I've stated numerous times, is limited, and we cannot say anything at any time, and this is exactly what the resolution is talking about. We cannot simply blurt out like and mar the freedom of assembly of the people in the funeral themselves. So the freedom of the First Amendment is a completely ridiculous argument. It makes a broad assumption that we can say anything at any time, and it's completely untrue. They don't have actually facts supporting what they're saying. They simply say that we have the freedom of speech, and you have to actually look at the rulings of the Supreme Court. Insofar as the Supreme Court rules that we limit what we can say at certain times, this is an appropriate thing, and it is not unconstitutional. What the affirmative case, it's not unconstitutional at all. So for these reasons, I affirm.
Everyone ready? All right, so again, thanks everyone for making today's debate possible. Let's explore the affirmations framework. So you'll see throughout their case that they constantly talk about the rights of others and the rights of the funeral mourners being infringed upon by these political demonstrations. By the framework that they have themselves created, they must prove that the rights of these funeral mourners are being infringed upon by the expression of speech by these political demonstrators. And you see that throughout their case, they don't actually show why these two rights are mutually exclusive and how there is actually an infringement of rights when it comes to the mourners. So for example, in order for something to be justifiable, it must be that they are infringing upon the rights of others per the framework of their case. And you see that throughout their case, they do not prove mutual exclusivity of these rights and therefore do not prove that one is actually infringing upon the other. Let's look to their first contention, for example. Okay, so they talk about basically how soldiers deserve the right to a burial and that it is an expression of their speech when they're joining the military. But just because there are political demonstrations at that soldier's funeral does not infringe upon that soldier's right to join the military and express himself in that way, shape, or form. That's what Gary said in his speech, and I ask you to extend that across the flow. There is no infringement upon the soldier's rights when there is that expression of speech. Moreover, they talk about how the soldiers aren't making a political stance, and they're doing it specifically to harm the funeral process. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that it actually is a political stance. In the Supreme Court decision, it was established that these protesters were doing this for publicity. But second of all, many of the protesters did not know the soldiers personally and weren't actually trying to harm the funeral process. Overall, in my refutation, what I want to convey is that there is no actual infringement of rights when it comes to the protesters infringing upon the rights of the soldiers. And in this way, it is not justifiable to take away the protesters' right to express themselves politically because it does not infringe upon the right of another. Now on to their second contention. So they basically talk about how you can restrict where things can be said, and there's a time and a place for everything. But the thing is that funerals that occur in public places are the exact time and place for these demonstrations because the public is the time and place for that expression. You cannot remove the public aspect of expression because when you restrict what someone can say in public, you completely restrict their First Amendment right, and who knows what could be restricted from there. Now down to their third contention. So they basically talk about if you're at all hurting the funeral mourners, you're being completely unethical. But again, throughout their case and the framework that they themselves set up, it is only unethical if you are violating the rights of others. And simply by hurting someone else's feelings, in no way are you violating their rights. For example, I might have a protest against something that the judges here might not like, and that might hurt their feelings. But again, that is not necessarily unethical because it does not violate those rights. That is simply a freedom of expression, and I'm simply expressing my opinion. Now down to their fourth contention, which got a little confusing. They talked about how basically a funeral is not a public event. So first of all, I like to say that the status quo is not the affirmative side, because currently you can have demonstrations at funerals that are in public places. So I'd like to clarify that before I jump into this refutation. But moreover, I'd like to say that we have to talk about public events, which these funerals very much are, or else they're not changing the status quo. And moreover, I'd like to say that I don't understand how this contention does in fact have bearing on the round. Yes?
So are you saying that the affirmative has to change the status quo?
Yes, that's what I'm saying in my refutation. I am. Yeah. Okay, so I'm basically saying that again, the affirmative does have to affirm does have to talk about a change in the status quo, and that's not what the affirmative side is in fact not the status quo. Yes.
Where does the warrant for that argument come from?
Okay, so basically you're talking about a motion. It says political demonstrations should not be allowed at funerals of deceased military personnel. Now the word should implies a significant change from the status quo, so that's where I'm getting my argument from. But I'd like to continue moving on with my entire idea that you do not continue to prove that it is justifiable through violating on the rights of others. Now their fifth contention talks about how people have the right to assemble, and again, this expression of political beliefs actually does infringe upon their right to assemble. But again, we do not see any mutual exclusivity between somebody demonstrating and between somebody else gathering at a funeral. There's no mutual exclusivity, and there's absolutely no infringement upon rights when there is a political demonstration outside an assembly. And in this way, shape, or form, their rights are not being infringed upon. They can still assemble, they can assemble somewhere privately, and they still do retain that right. Therefore, we see that restricting these political demonstrations and restricting that First Amendment right is not justifiable because it's not talking about infringing upon the rights of others. I'll try to get your question soon. Down to their sixth contention, they basically talk about soldiers are the reason why we do indeed have the First Amendment. And again, I agree with what Gary said. Yes, that is a very important fact. But again, we have to look at justifiable and we have to look at rights. And someone's simple expression does not infringe upon that soldier's right to join, or the fact that they, does not infringe upon the right to join or their First Amendment expression. Yes, your question?
How can you have funerals in private places if you've specifically stated that the resolution means that it must be a public place?
Okay, what I'm saying with like my entire private versus public point is that it's already been established that you can't simply barge into someone's house because that's a private place. You can't express yourself politically there, and the affirmative cannot be expected to talk about, cannot be expected to allow and to affirm somebody jumping into someone else's private procession when they're completely unwelcome. We can't affirm that in today's debate. That's why we have to be talking about public funerals and public places, because in no way can the negation come up here and say that yes, it is justifiable for you to break into someone's house completely unwarranted and for you to say whatever you want to say there. I hope that cleared up your question. Now down to our contention. I'd just like to flesh this out a little bit more and extend upon it. Again, the First Amendment right must be upheld. Now this is a fundamental right that cannot be taken away unless it has been proven to infringe upon the rights of others, at which point it does become justifiable, but only if it does infringe upon the rights of others. And in this way we see that they have not proven that it infringes upon the rights of others. Therefore we must uphold that crucial First Amendment which allows us to express ourselves. Just because somebody might have hurt feelings is not reason enough to restrict that First Amendment right, because I could say something that could hurt your feelings, and it could, and there's no right line or threshold for that. Moreover, just because something might slightly obscure the meaning of an event does not necessarily mean that it is justifiable in being removed. Because again, it must specifically infringe upon that right. As I end my speech, I'd just like to remind you that again, the act must prove that the rights of others are in fact being limited when there are these demonstrations in order for them to justify taking away a fundamental right, and they do not do so in today's debate. Thank you.
Alright, in this last speech, what I really think we need is a little bit of clarity so we can understand where all the points fall and how we can vote in today's debate. So first off, let's just talk about the resolution as a whole. when we're talking about political demonstrations, the negative team pretty much established that we're talking about, we're essentially talking about offensive but socially relevant protests, was what it boiled down to, is that it had to be socially relevant, otherwise the status quo already covered for it. Moreover, when we are talking about funerals of deceased military personnel, we have to be talking about public funerals at like a cemetery. Otherwise, there's no argument there because it's already illegal to barge into someone's like private, like if it was like in a church and you weren't invited and it was private and it was closed, you aren't allowed to barge in there. The reason we're debating about this, and I asked for clarification, they agreed that that's what we were debating on. The reason we were debating on that is because that's a gray area, because you have a public place and you have pretty much offensive things being said, but they have social relevance to a group of people. So there's that trade-off that we can debate on. Consistently throughout their case, and this is why I corrected their fourth contention, they say things like a funeral isn't a public place. They also say that the government already can restrict what you say. Pretty much, they're making these status quo arguments, but we are talking about a change in the status quo. They're going to come up here and say, no, we aren't talking about a change in the status quo, but the way that the framework is set up, the affirmative has to be solving for a change in the status quo. Essentially, what they want us to debate is that protesters can't go into private funerals and say things that are offensive to those people and malicious in trying to hurt those people. All right, that just broke like 4 Supreme Court cases, as well as went against everything that like the United States of America was founded upon. So that's why the negative team would never have to debate that. What I thought we were debating on rather is that gray area between a public place, specifically a military funeral, and your freedom of speech, whether or not it's offensive, as long as it has social relevance. That being said, much of the debate, which can be the first voter issue, the negative team has a much more topical and educational debate in talking about the actual public funerals that these are taking place in. Yes, I see concern.
Wait, so you're saying that you win the debate because you're more educational?
No, I don't say I win. In no way I'm saying that they should weigh that, because we spent more time educationally talking about this public place versus making arguments about barging into like private funerals. So no way am I saying that like we win, you can write up your ballot. The judges still have to weigh the actual advantages to both sides. More. Second voter issue is, yeah, you can have one more.
So could I come up in my next speech and rant about like some absurd philosophy and win the debate because it's educational?
No, because it wasn't in round. I mean, it's in a rebuttal. That being said, second argument, our second voter issue is that their arguments support the status quo, and you can't, I already said this, but I guess I'll repeat it. You can't barge into, because it gets to an impact, you can't barge into a protest in a private place. What you say cannot be obscene and socially worthless, and they have no unique arguments about the precedent that this sets. We brought up all these precedent issues that if you limit freedom of speech, I'm sorry, I don't have time. If you limit freedom of speech in a public place, that sets a poor precedent, because you are saying that this is a public place, and because people don't agree with what you're saying, you're not allowed to say it. Now, not enough debate happened there, so we weren't able to develop it fully, so you can see that the negative team wins that point, and that's one of the largest points in today's debate, is the actual precedent you're setting in the United States. Moreover, our third voter issue is what Stacey's speech established, that rights have to be violated, but the actual voter issue is that rights are maintained by supporting the negative. We can see that there's no mutual exclusivity with the protesters. Being offended isn't protected by the Constitution. And yes, and they do try to make a very strong pathos argument that bad things were being said. But once again, the things that were being said by the Westboro Baptist Church were ruled to make social actual impacts and to promote social change. And it wasn't to hurt the soldiers. Many of them didn't even know the soldiers. So that being said, what wins us the debate today is that at the same time, happening in the same area, in the same moment, both groups, both the funeral and the protest, can have freedom of speech and freedom of expression. That soldier was still able to die for his country and be respected in that place. Moreover, we can see that they were still able to assemble and make their own statement to the public. You have to break it down to its simple aspects when you're talking about a precedent. Moreover, both can still assemble in the same public space. You can see that the protesters can still be at the cemetery and the funeral can still have their own session at the same time. So for those reasons, yes, you can't yell bomb in a theater, but this isn't a theater that we're talking about, and you aren't saying things maliciously to hurt the soldier, otherwise it wasn't topical in the round. So for those reasons, because you still uphold rights, because their arguments support the status quo when that was not their position in today's debate, I urge the strongest vote on the negation.
can't really give like a clear, concise roadmap right now. I'm just gonna go with the key issues and try and tackle this. Oh, I'll just start on the end, like the and see how. Okay, so their entire case, or entire contention rather, has to do with specifically how the First Amendment is vital and how it secures our ability to speak, and how any limitation on this is entirely wrong unless we prove some rights violation. The first thing I came up here and said was that you have the right to a peaceful funeral as the final statement after you've enlisted in the military because of what this action undertakes and because of what this action means. This means these soldiers, have the right to a peaceful funeral because it's the culmination of the statement they made by joining the military. They're inherently infringing not only upon their right to a funeral, but second of all, upon the soldier himself or herself's right to have, or right to ensure that their statement by joining and enlisting the military is undertaken and heard out. Basically, the soldier is now dead at this point, so they can't make the statement on their own. So we need to make sure that the government comes in and protects these people, protects these burials as, well, a culmination of their freedom of speech. Yes.
What precedent, warrant, impact do you have that guarantees the soldier the right to peaceful burial?
Okay, this comes from both our contention 6 as well as our contention 1, talking about how they did. Our contention 1 was specifically they've given their life for the country, they deserve a proper burial. If we don't give them a proper burial, it denies the value of their lives. It uses their life as an expression of hatred. This is exactly what we're talking about. Also, they make the argument. Sorry, I really don't have time. Okay. Yeah. If there's a point of order for you, feel free to make it. There's no. Okay. So the basic point here is that they're using their funerals as a vehicle for hatred. They say that if it doesn't have social value, then it can specifically be, well, denied because it's no longer part of freedom of speech. However, the statements that are being made have no clear social value. These statements, which I've said since my first speech, were things like God hates fags and thank God for IEDs. They have no social value whatsoever. Based on my opponent's own precedent, this can be denied.
Isn't that then not a part of the round? If it has no social value, then isn't it not
well,
part
then
of
you're
the framework?
fiating away all affirmative ground. I'm sorry. This is the exact examples of what we've been talking about. You've been talking about the case of Westboro versus Snyder throughout the entire debate. These are exact quotes from this event taking place. I mean, we are talking about the exact same court case. These were the statements made. I said these statements earlier, and they said that they had social value, or they said that supposedly they have social value, but I most strictly believe they aren't. We haven't had any other examples brought up in the round except for these. We can assume that they're being used as demonstrations of hatred and have no social value whatsoever. I'm really sorry. Yeah. Okay, also they talk about rights violations and how if we can prove one rights violation, then assuming we'd win the round. First of all, we have the right to a peaceful burial. Second of all, we have the they talk about specifically how we don't have the right to protect people from reactions. However, my partner said in his last speech specifically, we react to murder by feeling a certain way. We believe moral is wrong because of our inherently human reactions. So we can assume that the speech that's being undertaken at these funerals is inherently wrong and immoral. We define our laws in our society based upon our reactions. And our fourth argument had to do with how a funeral isn't a public event. They said, well, basically we're only talking about funerals in public events. But I'm talking about how these people are assembling and the point they are trying to undertake by doing this in general. They are trying to support and feel compassion and mourn for their dead soldier, and this is being drastically inhibited by the protesters being there. It entirely erases the atmosphere and the purpose of these people assembling. So it's infringing upon the right to assemble of the funeral themselves, especially because it takes away all value from the burial of itself, and in fact directs it to these hateful and slanderous messages that are being stated. Finally, on to our fifth contention. Has to do with the family has the First Amendment right to freedom of religion, allowing them to undertake their funeral however they so please, and also they have the right to freedom of assembly. Stacy, I believe it was, says in her speech that this does infringe upon the right to assemble. This is a direct quote. This provides the rights violation that she was talking about. Also, basically, it does infringe upon their rights to assemble because it's drastically harming these.
Okay, on point of order, I just said it does not infringe. That's,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Well, basically, it's infringing upon their right to assemble, even if basically they're causing these people to no longer have the same rights, and it's harming these individuals. And in general, these people are entirely destroying the statement made by the funeral. The soldier can no longer make the statement, so the government must make the statement for them. And this is why the government has the obligation to uphold freedom of speech by preventing these protesters from demonstrating at the rallies, because they entirely, take away any right to speech and the statement that this soldier deserves. And finally, the right to a funeral is directly from the First Amendment and freedom of speech, because this is their final statement. Thank you.